Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to another episode. My name is Naveed Husain. I'm a divorce attorney in Chicago. Today I'm joined by Dr. Fahad Khan. He is a clinical psychologist and the deputy director at the Khalil Center. So stick around for a very important conversation. You look good, mashallah. Okay, bro. Thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah.
I know we've been talking about divorce in the community for a long time. I mean, since you started Khalil Center or working at Khalil Center, we did that program at Bolingbrook Motion and stuff like that. So I wanted to talk to you today about domestic violence, especially in the Muslim community, because I know that you're dealing with it, I'm dealing with it. And so, part of the series is to try to prevent divorce and to prevent domestic violence and things like that. So can you give us a little bit of what is domestic violence?
Okay. So I think one of the problems that we have nowadays is that there are certain buzzwords and phrases that we use, and sometimes we tend to overuse them as well. So I mean, domestic violence is real. I think some studies on Muslims have shown, I think, upwards of 40%. But in my work here now, granted that I think there's bias when it comes to whatever I'm saying. There's going to be some biases that are in my head too. But in my work here, I've seen about, I would say, less than 10, maybe 10 to 15% of the cases that had domestic violence. It's possible that they didn't talk about it because of the shame and stigma associated with it. But what I'm trying to say is that the term trauma, violence, domestic abuse, they're very subjective, right? So, for example, if I hit my wife, right? Like if I hit her, that's violence. I mean, no one will say that's not violence, right? With the intention of me hurting her. Even if the intention wasn't there, intention was something else, but if I hit her, maybe not playfully, that might be, considered violence. But then if you take a step down from that, like when it comes to emotional abuse, psychological abuse, I think those things are more subjective, right? So then it's all up to the individual. Anyone can make the claim that I'm being abused.
Yeah.
How do you know someone is being abused? That's a very challenging thing to separate and to figure out. And so, given that, I think the research that's there that talks about 40% or something, 41% prevalence, it puts all of that under domestic violence, right? So emotional abuse, psychological abuse, and then physical abuse, and then also sexual abuse. So, and the question is how much of it is physical abuse? In my cases, like I said, I've seen 10 to 15% probably at most. That's actual physical violence.
But are you seeing the quote unquote the abuser or the victim of the domestic violence? So when you're giving me those numbers, who are you talking about?
Right. So I'm talking about marital cases where there's actual physical violence or abuse that existed. Now, I mostly work with men, and men tend to be mostly perpetrators, but they can also be the receivers and victims. But most of them, and if they probably do receive it, they're not going to say it, right? Especially the emotional and psychological part, and even the physical part. They're not going to come in and admit that they are being physically abused by their wife. For example.
And also I'm sure the victim also isn't readily coming out and talking about it too. Yeah.
And that's why I said that my data could be biased as well. But coming from all those perspectives, I think, and I've seen really bad cases too, like marriage cases where. And in our field, they always tell us that you shouldn't do counseling when there's domestic violence, when there's physical abuse.
Okay.
And I have successfully done marital counseling, with a couple where there was so much physical abuse that one of them ended up in the emergency room, right? But alhamdulillah, they were able to grow from it.
Yeah.
So I think that assessing for safety is important. We can talk about that too. But certainly I think it is a reality. And the other piece that a lot of people that don't think about is that any kind of negative interaction between parents has a significant psychological effect on the child because they're developing, right? Yeah. So if they look at their parents fighting with each other, arguing out loud, even if it's not related to any kind of abuse, maybe it's just a argument over, which biryani is better, right? But for the child can't understand that. They just hear loud voices and they think something is wrong. Yeah. For them it could be traumatic.
Oh, absolutely. So from the legal perspective, so the definition of domestic violence or something that would require an order of protection would be physical abuse, harassment, stalking, not letting them have their own space, that type of thing. And so I can see from like how a psychological perspective, the definition of domestic violence is, more amorphous and more broad, whereas in the legal terms, you have to kind of define it because you need some type of remedy for that domestic violence. So I can see the difference there. And so do you think there's anything special within the Muslim community that, or do we have higher domestic violence stats than the non-Muslim community? Is there something within our community that makes us more prevalent to this? What do you think of? Do you see this as a big problem?
I see it as a big problem. I mean, I think, and at the backbone of that problem, precursor to that is overall lack of emotional intelligence, emotional control, ability to be assertive, not being able to draw the line between what is assertive and what is aggressive, for example. And a lot of that comes from our upbringing as well, and then we're creatures that, like, when we observe something, we take it on. So growing up, if you see your parents argue out loud, throw things around, push each other, hit each other, then you get used to those things, right? So there's social learning that takes place. So now, I don't know if a study that compares Muslims to non-Muslims, but if I had to guess, I would say it's probably the same. I don't think it's more prevalent. But I will say that as Muslims, even a little bit of it is for us is a problem, right? So when you say, "Oh, is alcoholism more prevalent in Muslim?" That's not the question. There should be no alcoholism, right? There should be no extramarital, premarital, intimacy. So all of these things, I think, even a little bit is bad for us.
Yeah, that's a good point. So for like somebody who is the perpetrator in this circumstance, so you talked about emotional intelligence. What can somebody who has, I don't know, are they outbursts? Is it anger? Is it control? What do you think is causing? Obviously, it's hard to give a blanket statement, but in general, what do you think is causing, or what causes domestic violence, or what can lead someone to strike their wife or their husband?
Right. I think if I have to pick one thing, it would be lack of self-awareness, right? So, I mean, most of us, not most of us, well, some of us grew up in households where, the parenting wasn't ideal, right? And our parents made mistakes, and we're parents and we're going to make mistakes. I think that's part of the process. There was a quote that I heard a long time ago that really stuck with me. It said, if you're going to blame your parents for all the things that went wrong, then give them credit for all the things that went right. So they did a lot of great things, and then some areas where they could have done a little bit better. But the thing is, when you hit adulthood, as Muslims, it is now our responsibility, right? So if we went through traumas, if we went through, childhood experiences, adverse childhood events that caused us and shaped us to have a certain type of personality, it is our responsibility as adults to help ourselves. And that isn't going to fix itself. People oftentimes think over time people will change, over time people will get better, or when somebody gets married, they're going to improve. It doesn't happen automatically. It requires a lot of self-awareness. And that self-awareness can come through, sometimes people just gain it by themselves. It's rare, but it can happen. And oftentimes it requires someone else, like a therapist, a good friend, even a wife, right? Like, I mean, there's things that my wife told me and made me aware of that I wasn't aware of before. Mm-hmm. And I realized I need to work on it. Even an enemy, Imam Ghazali says, can tell you about you things that other people won't tell you, right? So all these are sources of knowledge for us in terms of gaining awareness into our own deficiencies and problems. But that, I think, it would be probably the first and the most important step. Okay. Becoming aware of, like, okay, am I being angry? Am I getting angry right now? How angry am I? What made me react in a certain way? And if you have that level of awareness, then eventually you come to a point where you can prevent it. Sometimes it takes time, like the examples that I've given of couples that I've worked with. The physical part ended, and it was made clear that you cannot lay your hands on your spouse, and the safety of the spouse was always assessed. But that didn't mean that the person wouldn't get angry, right? That didn't mean they didn't have the tendency to want to hurt the other person. But eventually, when you build that self-awareness, they're able to recognize those patterns beforehand and prevent it.
So that's a good point. So, like, for somebody who's looking to get married, is there any signs that you can look for? Or, I know you do premarital counseling, for example. So is there a mechanism to figure out if these tendencies are there before people get married?
That's a tough one because, see, before we get married, we haven't gone through that experience of living with someone 24 hours, someone who is now, like, permanently associated with you, right? And when I say permanent, I mean, of course, people get divorced, but until divorce, right? And you have to deal with them. There's no, like, you and I were roommates in college, so if you have a bad roommate, you can just next year go live somewhere else, right? or all if you get together and kick them out, right? Something like that, right? But you can't do that with your wife, right?
Yeah.
Like that's not ideally going to be the case for your husband. So some of these tendencies sometimes don't come out until you're actually in that position, right? And there's no way to evaluate it unless the person has gone, it has been in the same situation before. Like if you know somebody's been previously married and they were violent, they're likely to be violent again. Best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. But if they've never been married before, it's hard to really know, like, will this person be violent or not? Sometimes, no, I don't want to say these things because I think people get turned off easily by others. Like if there's a history of violence in their family, now it doesn't always mean they're going to be violent, right?
Yeah.
If they haven't worked on it, they don't realize the patterns and intergenerational trauma, then they might pass this on. But that's not the indication that you shouldn't marry somebody because their parents had a domestic violence issue.
In the premarital counseling, I know you do like tests and stuff like that, so it probably wouldn't come up on the test or anything.
So I mean, we do like a personality assessment. We do like love language assessments. In personality assessment, you might see like someone. There's an anger like a scale there. It might you might see that, or anxiety, or even depression. You might see someone being a bit more assertive. People who are overly assertive can come off as aggressive sometimes, but there's no one way to determine this person is going to be violent unless they go through it.
Of course. And then
and even from a psychological perspective, emotional like abuse, there's no way to determine that beforehand. Unless you've dealt with the individual for a very long time, and then you're like, man, this person's manipulative, or they have certain tendencies that you shouldn't be with them.
Yes, subhanAllah. So like from the woman's side, like somebody, or from the victim side, we hear about this circle of violence or the cycle of violence, and we see battered women syndrome and things like that. Like, what can you tell people who are victims of domestic violence? How can they get past it? How can they help themselves to open up or seek help? Can you give us something?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that first of all, safety assessment is important, right? If somebody's not safe, it is their right to feel safe, right? So, if you're living with someone and you don't feel safe, now, it is a subjective term, but I mean, let's start with something that is very easy to assess, which is physical violence. If you're being physically abused, then you need to assess, like make sure that you feel safe there or not. When I say subjective, I mean somebody might say, I don't feel safe with this person because they're manipulative, or they're like gaslighting or something, right? I mean, some of these words I'm not a big fan of, but people use them. So assessing safety is important, but usually what you'll notice is when people get married, nobody is going to, it's very rare for someone to beat their spouse like the next day, right? You'll see patterns developing over time. You'll see things, signs. And so what you have to do is you have to kind of be assertive and catch them early on, and in a very like kind way. I think one of the problems is that we live in a society where everyone thinks they're right. Right? And I have my way of doing things, you have your way of doing things. My wife has her own way of doing things. If we get married, I'm going to think my way is the right way, right? But I'm not open to the idea that maybe whatever they're doing is also okay, right? Or both of us can be okay by doing things differently. And so when we have differences, we just don't know how to talk about these differences. And that's what causes a lot of conflict. People just can't talk to each other about, hey, I would appreciate if things happen this way. Or this is what I'm used to, this is how I used to do things. And so that kind of leads to like people not really talking about, I noticed that you your voice, you raised your voice when you were talking to me. That's something I don't like, and I don't appreciate it. But can you tell me what happened? Like, what made you raise your voice? Like, what was it? Maybe it helps the other person open up a little bit, right? So you kind of pick up on these patterns early on. It can be avoided. But then there are certain people, like I said, through social learning, through their own emotional problems, unresolved depression, anxiety, frustrations, that leads towards anger, and they just go from 0 to 100 immediately.
Allah protect us.
I mean,
I'm seeing a lot of domestic violence or cases of mother-in-law, daughter-in-law violence, like literal violence. Like, I mean, subhanAllah, I have an order of protection case right now where like the mother-in-law like grabbed her and the scratches, and almost not, it's an alarming number. And so any advice for mother-in-law, daughter-in-law type of, I know it's related because it seems like for the woman, this is domestic violence,
Right.
with the abuse, the harassment, that type of thing can rise to that level. So any advice in that situation?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think this is where the husband will play a huge role, right? So before, and I do this with my premarital, before they get married, I always ask about what is the understanding of where you're going to live after you get married. Now, most couples will say we'll be living separately. The next question is there any kind of understanding that after a certain time, or maybe down the line, that the husband's parents will be living with them? Right? It's usually the husband's parents, right? That's culturally that's the case.
Yeah.
I think if we look at it from an Islamic perspective, the responsibility of the parent lies equally upon all the children, male or female.
Mm-hmm.
Culturally, it goes towards the men,
Yeah.
right? Which is fine. I understand. I mean, usually men are the breadwinners. They have the money, and they're able to do more with that. But it is the responsibility of the husband to have that clear division, and some level of clarity between this. My wife has certain rights, and my mother and my father have certain rights, right? Like I can't subjugate. I can't expect my wife to take care of my parents. They're not her parents. I shouldn't do that, right? People oftentimes will use like the phrase, "Oh, she's like my daughter," like for the daughter-in-law. But there's no such thing as like my in Islam, right? Either you are or you aren't. She's not your daughter, right? Mother-in-law is not your mother. No matter how much you want her to be your mother, that relationship is not going to be there. So that the husband's job is to be able to create that, and ideally, I mean, even from fiqh perspective, it should be clearly separate, right? Separate housing, separate everything. That would be ideal. And if the person's not ready if the husband or the male figure in this case feels like psychologically they cannot, separate, or they cannot create a boundary between their wife and their mother, they're not ready for marriage, right? Like that's a very important part of what my parents live with me, right? So we live in the same space.
Yeah, so.
But like I can tell you that if you are like aware of the situation, if you know how to handle both sides, then it can work. But if you're not, that's where it causes problem. Yeah. It's my job to make sure that my mom knows that she cannot, like overpower my wife, and my wife knows the same thing. We've seen cases where the daughter-in-law is abusive towards the mother-in-law as well.
Yeah, of course.
In one case where the son, because of the wife, ended up hitting his mother. All of these cases are there.
Yeah.
But that comes with like people who are just not aware of these boundaries and they can't implement them.
So going back, you said, the first thing from a woman's perspective or the victim's perspective, to get out of this cycle of violence or to understand that they're even in it, the first thing you said was to assess safety. And I think I might have cut you off when we started talking about mother-in-law, daughter-in-law, but how can somebody realize that they're in this cycle and like stepping out of it or seeing like it from an outside perspective? Because you see it going on for generations or for years and years, and it's almost like the other people are like, okay, just do something about it. So from that perspective, why can't they do something about it, and how can they do something about it?
Yeah, so I think going back to the self-awareness piece, like we have the best example of Husain, right? I mean, people sometimes will bring in the ayah in the Quran and say, strike them or whatever, right? But the Prophet at one point had, I think, 7 wives, right? And we know from his seerah that he never once laid his hand on any of his wives. And there was conflict, right? There was the conflict is in the Quran in the Sunnah as well. But we can see it, and so I think we have to go back to that. And one of the things that I've seen is like we've grown up in a society, and I think our parents to a certain extent too, where we get used to certain things. So using like foul language, for example, right? Calling someone certain names, and in the beginning it's just that, but then it gets worse when and I say even to my premarital couples that don't even playfully hit each other, because if you get used to playfully hitting each other, you will hit each other when you're angry with each other, right? Don't even playfully call someone a name, right? You're such a whatever, right? And so I think if we went back to the Sunnah, which is like perfect your character, tahdhib al-akhlaq, right? Your own akhlaq, is it the way the Prophet ﷺ reacted? Then it wouldn't even come to that. And if you notice something like this person, the way he speaks or she speaks, the way he handles anger, all of that is not like how it should be. And you can intervene, and husband and wife have such an intimate relationship that some things that your wife may tell you, you might be able to take it a lot easier, right? If you're at that level, especially in the beginning of the marriage, then you can talk about it. But most people, because we have our own problems, we're not working on our own problems, it's hard to go to someone and say, hey, you have an anger problem, and then they might come back and say, oh yeah, but you do this, right? It's difficult. So work on our own selves, and then like try to comparatively speaking to our the Sunnah of the Prophet, see how it is. And if you notice some patterns that are off, even though societally they might be okay, it might be acceptable, but it's good to sit with them and have a conversation. I tell my couples, do a weekly check-in. Nice. Ideally, from week one. Right? It's not like when things start getting rough. Yeah. From week one, sit down. What are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? That's when you can say, hey, I noticed that you do this more. I'll give you one example, and this is, again, for my wife too, and she was so helpful in like helping me understand something. I had a training in one of my supervisors, and he would often use like words that were just not appropriate. And we worked in my internship was at a facility where there were a lot of children taken from DCFS, by DCFS. So, they grew up in a very rough neighborhood. They used a lot of foul language. So I was sitting at home one time and I was talking, I don't know if I was talking about something, and some words slipped out. And she said, I've never heard this from you before. Where's this coming from, right? Yeah. And like, it just caught me up. I'm like, wow, I didn't realize that, right? And I went back and I thought about it. And I'm like, it's probably because I'm spending 40, 50 hours a week at this place where people are talking like this. Sohbah matters, right? 100%. Yeah. And so, but it wasn't appropriate, so like she in a way was able to correct me, and alhamdulillah, and may Allah reward her for that. And then it made me realize that. So I think that if we did these kind of like check-ins with each other, and if we took someone's advice without getting defensive, you might get defensive initially, but you come back and say, you know what? I think this person had a good point. If we did all of these preventative work, it doesn't come to that. And
I mean, before we wrap up, any other final advice about domestic violence? And then I do want to ask you, because of, mashallah, your experience in the community and, about marriage too, then your final advice on, making our marriages strong or, something like that. So anything you'd like to add about domestic violence?
So about the other pieces of violence, right? So physical violence, like I said, is sometimes pretty clear in most cases. The non-physical element of violence and abuse are not very clear oftentimes. And I've seen many cases where one person's claiming that the other person's violent. Or like I use the word gaslighting, right? I mean, gaslighting is often used like, oh, this person made me think I was crazy, or I had some problem, even though the problem wasn't there. I think that kind of like thought process that, somehow if somebody tells me to work on myself or to reconsider what I said or what I did, then they might be gaslighting, right? I think this defensiveness that we have between husband and wife, it doesn't help. You see what I mean? Like, then it leads to like this subjective feeling of psychological abuse. And then if it happens more frequently, it can turn into abuse, right? So what I'm trying to say is that like we need to be very cognizant of like if somebody comes to us, like Imam Ghazali said, if your enemy even comes to you and says something, consider it, think about it. Like, in any situation, it's either, oh no, he's at fault or she's at fault. No, you could be 10% at fault, you can be 20% at fault. Take responsibility for what you did wrong. You don't have to take a blanket apology over everything. Yeah. That's what people do. It's like, either I love you or I hate you. Well, you might feel a little bit of love. You might feel a little bit of hate. Or it's like, I'm sorry for everything. No, don't say sorry for everything. Yeah. Say sorry for what you did wrong. Like, own what you did wrong. And you don't have to take responsibility for what you didn't do.
Be more nuanced in that discussion of what's going well and what's going bad, and accounting for yourself. Absolutely. No, that's a really good point. Exactly. This gaslighting term also reminds me of narcissism term that's been kind of thrown around. I don't know if that's what you're... Yes. That's kind of what reminded me of that word, because it's been going around everywhere. So, I mean, is there any link there between this...
I mean, like, if you think about it, right, human beings have a tendency to, like, tell somebody, like, something, right? Like, I might want to tell you, like, here's how you do things. You want to tell me... Now, if we're close, we might do it even more frequently, right? And I think between giving advice, which some people are horrible at giving advice, and, like, gaslighting, which could be real. Like, some people actually do, like, let's say a husband or a wife is cheating or doing something wrong, and then the other person, when they question their behavior, they're like, no, you're doubting me, it's your problem. Like, that actually does happen, right? But I think people tend to use these words, or narcissism, like at the back of narcissism is arrogance, right? Or pride. Now, pride is part of who we are, although it's one of the spiritual sicknesses. Right, so absolutely, it's a problem, and everybody suffers from it. Like, it's not something that, like, everybody has some level of pride and arrogance in their heart. So not everything will be about narcissism. Not everything will be about some of these terminologies. I think we have to get out of these isms and try to get into really, like, what is the ultimate reality of what we live in, without getting too philosophical. But I think that's the problem, is that people, and then immediately all the behaviors, I'm married to a narcissist. I'm married to someone who's doing, or she's borderline. Like these kind of things are thrown out so easily, and I'm like, it's not that black or white.
And I think that by putting a label on it, it actually makes it harder to fix, right? Because, like you said, you have to be nuanced about what's going right and what's going wrong. If you slap a label on somebody, now everything's wrong because they have that label on it. It actually makes it worse, I think, if you're, like you said, putting the isms on it.
And then confirmation bias, right? Yeah. So if you've determined that your spouse or someone is a certain way, then all the behaviors that point towards it, you're going to remember and keep in your mind, and all the behaviors that go against it, you're going to just discard them, because that's what we naturally do.
Yes, I don't know. All right, man, as we wrap up, anything about marriage? People want to only watch for 15-20 minutes, they don't have too much long attention span, but we can talk for hours, mashallah. We have so much history, so much experience, but to kind of wrap it up in terms of marriage advice, anything you can leave us with?
I would say for anyone getting married, and especially from the perspective of domestic violence and avoiding it, try your best, even though we live in a world. So like I said before, we live in a world where you think about yourself first, right? Just make yourself happy, do what you need to do, right? When you go into a marriage, if you go with that kind of mindset that, I'm going in and what can he or she do for me, that's the worst thing you can do for yourself. Don't go in demanding rights, right? In fact, if you go in giving up everything, and I'm in it to sacrifice myself, and inshallah, if you go with that mindset, there's barakah in there too, that you'll find that you're going to get a lot more out of it. Don't go in with all these expectations. Don't go in with, this is what I'm looking for. This is one of the reasons why people aren't getting married these days is this problem. Like whoever they talk to, they're like, this person is demanding all of these things. I don't think that I can fulfill them. And it's not like they're physical demands. Look, I want my husband to be this way. I want my wife to be this way. You're not going to find that perfect individual. Go in with, and divorce is something that is allowed in Islam. So there are people who are married and they're in a horrible relationship and they should be, and they're not even considering it. So, we try to avoid it and we do our best to prevent it. But if time comes for it, then, you just have to say, it didn't work out. And amicably separate and divorce before you hurt yourself and your children.
Yeah. Do you see divorces like for proper reasons, or do you think that they're becoming superfluous, or kind of like, why are you getting divorced, or do you see that as, like you said, this divorce is allowed in Islam, and for certain situations it's there. In my circumstances, I've actually seen it where there actually probably is a reason for divorce.
I think there's definitely cases where there's a reason. I think one extreme is where people get married and when they start having normal and natural arguments, which every marriage has. I tell this to my premarital couples, every individual who's married has contemplated divorce or had the thought that maybe you shouldn't have married this person. Sure. I won't share what you told me before. I'm kidding. But, everybody has even the thought that, man, I should have married this person. Or what if I had not married this or married that person? These are shaitani thoughts that are there, right? They'll always be there. But what people do is when they go through their normal fights, which sometimes people come in for marital counseling, 6 months into marriage, and they're like, we're arguing. And I'm like, okay, so what?
That's normal.
What do you want me to do? You're supposed to argue. Yeah. That's part of the process of building a relationship. This is why the researchers on marriage say there's a honeymoon phase, and then there's almost 5 to 7 years of rough time. But when you get through the rough time, there's a second honeymoon phase, which is sometimes even better than the first honeymoon phase, because you learned the ways, and now you can enjoy each other's company. But during that time, people are like, no, I want to get a divorce. So I think that's one thing. And then there's the real reasons, right? My sister was married to somebody who lied about their first marriage. He was still previously married, but he lied about it. That's a real reason to be divorced, right? Yeah. So there are actual real reasons that why people should be divorced, and then they're not getting divorced. Or their relationship is so horrible, they're traumatizing their children. Things aren't getting any better. They've tried everything. They're like, no, for the sake of, just preserving their whatever, name and face in the community, or, it's for the sake of kids. They'll say it, but, it's a selfish thing to say because you're actually hurting the kids more. So those people, that's the other extreme.
Allahu Akbar, man.
Yeah.
Jazakallah khair, man, for your time. I really appreciate it. And until next time, inshallah.
Anytime.
Assalamu alaikum. Bro, Jazakallah khair, man.
Yakum.
Felt like old times.
I know.